I'm going to begin my discussion today with an invocation of one of my favorite philosophers and mathematicians and scientists. Not the gentleman you see behind me, but one that's from Italy, from Florence, Galileo, who essentially says, basically, that the universe is written in mathematics. Now, I'm beginning my discussion with Galileo, but invoking Buckminster Fuller, precisely because there's a juxtaposition. Each of them thought that the world could be transformed through increasing knowledge. So, when I begin a discussion with something like Buckminster Fuller and saying love is omni-inclusive, you have to imagine that there's a component of design, a component of architecture, and above all, a component that the idea that information itself is about compassion and sharing. Nothing exists separately. Everything is connected. That's something that both Da Vinci could explain, and also we can see in the 21st century as social media creates more and more of a dialogue between almost every aspect of anyone who is involved with information aesthetics. So I'm just talking about information aesthetics from the viewpoint of sampling a collage. And this is a really interesting chart that Intel put out a little while ago about what happens in 1 minute on the internet. The former CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, likes to go around explaining this idea that we now create over 5 petabytes of data a year, which is more than most of human history combined previously. So for example, in 1 internet minute, you have over, 20 million photo views on Flickr, 6 million Facebook views, 3.5 million Google inquiries, you name it. And you have sirens behind you too. So at the hit of this kind of like 1 minute, 60 seconds, you have to imagine that humanity has generated more than most of us would ever experience in one lifetime. So how do we navigate this information overload? How do we think about it as the viewpoint of a new kind of palette for artists? Artists are always people who hold this mirror up to society. And for myself, as someone involved with music, for me, the idea is now that the arts are much more about pattern recognition. So I'd like to play a short video clip of a project that I'm working on currently that I think will give you a little bit of context. I just want to ask the audience, how many of you use Facebook, out of curiosity? Well, okay, 100%. Now, how many of you used Napster? Okay, maybe 30%. So one person is actually a common denominator for both of those software systems, and his name is Sean Parker. Sean Parker is now, I believe, a 31 or 30-year-old billionaire, and his partner for Napster, the guy who wrote most of the source code, is a gentleman by the name of Sean Fanning. Sean Fanning wrote the source code for Napster, I believe, if I remember correctly, at age 16. So what happened in the late 90s was this idea that file sharing became a new kind of social sculpture. So I'm pointing this out in the context of love, because this is what we're talking about, because it's about sharing. We're thinking about the idea of the gift economy. We're thinking about the idea of the gift of sound and the gift of the idea of using a network to create a more robust social sphere. So I'd like to play this video clip, and I did the music for it. It's a film project that's going to be about mega upload, download, BitTorrent, Napster, all of these kind of file sharing media. So if we can just play the video. A little bit louder.
You're talking about revolutionizing the way we use computers.
The fact that you could kind of share emotion over the internet, something so important to you, you could just trade so freely.
That's what was so profoundly different about the explosion of the internet, was that it was one network. So suddenly you could be connected to everyone.
I released an early beta version of the Napster software during the summer, and it spread quickly by word of mouth. It hasn't stopped growing since.
Just, wanted to create a way to meet people through music. Music will be ubiquitous, and we believe, you'll be able to get it on your cell phone, you'll be able to get it on whatever the device of the future is.
We knew it was a long way off from all the music being available digitally. And then there it was.
I just felt like this was one of the great moments in human history.
This is a company that is building a business. They've got venture capital money.
My response to him, I couldn't type it fast enough, was, don't take the money. You don't have a business.
They're building a business by facilitating the stealing of artist music.
We saw the clicks of the numbers, and that's what they were downloading at that particular time. That was shocking.
The music business is a great example of just complacency being a total death sentence.
I thought that the way that people got music for the last 50 years worked.
The record companies are not adjusting to technology.
Major music industries, entire floors were turning their lights off.
I'm bootleg proof, you dig? That's great, isn't it?
Metallica was coming to our office.
What we're merely doing is giving Napster the information that they thought that we couldn't get him.
Napster is stealing from us, straight up, and I'm going to fight them to the death.
As last fall semester wore on, hundreds quickly turned to millions, with the program spreading across college campuses like wildfire.
Nearly 60 million people use the site to swap music files from each other's computers for free.
We literally went from being high school kids leading normal, mundane lives to 12 months later bringing one of the largest U.S. industries to its knees and basically fighting what is the largest corporate lawsuit in the history of the world.
Lawyers representing Napster and the recording industry squared off before a 3-judge panel.
What is it capable of being used for? We are not trying to stop the internet, certainly.
The final word on Napster will eventually end up coming from the U.S. Supreme Court.
Music downloaders, beware. The recording industry is suing computer users.
What they've done is to turn an entire generation of kids into electronic Hezbollah.
A bomb went off, and nobody knew what the hell was happening.
It has changed everything.
It's obviously so big, it's out of their control.
The cat wasn't going back in the bag.
Now the people have a choice.
There's no stopping it. You know, this revolution is already taken place.
So I begin my discussion with an invocation of Galileo and then move to Buckminster Fuller, but then talk about what's going on with the idea of social sculpture, the amount of information people are exchanging about the self. So there's another really interesting quote from that Buckminster Fuller that I wanted to riff on at the second half, where he's talking about the love of the other. So if you're sending and receiving material and information and updates and ideas about every aspect of your social self, you've created a new kind of theater. Now, in Italian, you have the term persone, which just means the sound of the mask. So if we're thinking about data and data aesthetics and this new kind of palette, the artist is using this notion of information aesthetics to create a new persona. So in the 19th century, semiologists like Ferdinand de Saussure were trying to figure out how language shaped and molded the idea of identity. But in the 21st century, as we move further and further into an information-based economy, almost all aspects of what it means to be the self, the subject, the object, all of those have blurred. So if you look at philosophy, and if you look at semiotics, if you look at how people have thought about this for centuries, there's Italian philosophers like Giordano Bruno, there's mathematicians like Johannes Kepler, many of whom are thinking that information would be the key to understanding the harmony of the universe. So when you look at something for a natural phenomena, I'm going to use an example of a snowflake, what you're seeing here is not just a piece of ice. It's actually a mathematical distillation. You're seeing essentially a hexagonal pattern that's folded in on itself, and there's a kind of recursive logic at work. You can see the same thing in every piece of ice. So Johannes Kepler was on his way home in 1611 and saw a snowflake land on his sleeve. And the idea was that this kind of incredibly precise piece of nature had landed on his arm, and he went home and wrote a series of essays and mathematical treatises that were some of the first to really coherently paint out mathematics in nature. So as we move further into the 21st century, the human idea of nature, the idea of natural versus artificial, the idea of love for the environment, reflection of the self, these are all things that I'm kind of exploring with the idea of how art is now kind of a permutation mirror. So Norbert Wiener coined the term cybernetics, and one of my favorite kind of thinking about this is the idea of loops and recursive logic, because it's called feedback. So if you're thinking about love, it's about this idea of reflexivity. It's about the idea of putting something out into the world in a way that you're never quite sure what's going to come back, and that's the gift economy. So if we're thinking about loops and layers, if we're thinking about collage, that means we're looking at pattern recognition as the basis of an information-based economy. One of my favorite bands, Pink Floyd, even used the same kind of image for one album cover, which I always think is the idea of semiology as recursive. So if you're thinking about sound and this idea of the self, so much of what we're thinking about right now is this idea of the acoustic construction of space. And many philosophers like Gaston Bachelard, for example, have also explored a similar kind of approach. But from the arts, we have to think about this idea of a free-floating signifier, of something that is transformable and constantly updating and changing, and that's the idea of the second self. So in philosophy, if you look at Jean-Paul Sartre, if you look at Simone de Beauvoir, we've seen a century of people trying to explore this from different essays, from different ideas of writing, and above all, thinking about a Western context. But as we move further into an information-based economy, these are things that I'm going to be finding, I feel more and more important as we try and think about this idea of dematerialization. And that's where electronic music and this idea of pattern recognition has become basically the vocabulary of people growing up in a digital media context. So in the early 1920s, one of my favorite artists, Jean Cocteau, did a piece called Marriage at the Eiffel Tower. What's interesting is that it's one of the first idea of modernist sets. And again, if you look at that snowflake I was pointing out to you earlier, there's a kind of symmetry at work. What ends up happening is two characters walk on stage who are supposed to be married or in love, and they basically press one record each, and the records start talking to each other, and the other characters walk off stage. So you can see Jean Cocteau doing a rehearsal where he's recording his speech onto a phonograph that's meant to be looped. And so the characters are in love, but it's just loops. And so each record player is talking to itself, and this is considered to be one of the first theater pieces to use records. So the characters were this idea of a phonographic skipping loop, because they end up in disputes and have arguments and eventually have a divorce. You know, this is what happens. So if you think about recursion and the idea of layering, we can go back to some of the earlier ideas. Because we're in Italy, I thought I would reference a little bit more of Italian history, like Cicero, and the idea of the memory palace, this idea of the ars memoria. So if you're thinking about sampling and collage and the idea of layering, who owns memory? That's why I was showing that video clip earlier, because I'm very interested in this idea that sampling is about shared memories. And again, if you're going back to this idea of empathy, love, and exploring the self and other, these are issues that I think we're going to be finding more and more complex as we move into the memory palace. Other artists and philosophers have also explored this from the idea of that we structure memory from the viewpoint of the harmony of the world. So if you go back to ancient Greece, like Pythagoras and many other philosophers from that time period, the 5th and 6th century Athens, they were trying to figure out how do we think about pattern recognition as the basis of the world. And that's beginning to be the scientific inquiry that people like Galileo championed. So as an artist, I'm very interested in this as a structured sense of mnemosyne. This is our early Greek muse. But from my point of view, it's computation. So the art of memory is about moving through dematerialized structures. It's about what they call memory loci. And above all, how do we combine all of those to create new structures? If you see a flock of birds, for example, they can all turn on a dime and move in kind of an incredibly precise symmetry. Birds are not mathematical creatures, but in a flock, they all understand each other's movement. So too with social media. If we map the idea of the human onto this idea of flocking mechanisms and exchange of material and data, we're all triangulating and measuring each other's distances, measuring each other's ideas of statements and motion, but above all, we're exchanging the idea of coded culture. So if code conditions culture, how do we think about the next 15 years of what art will be? I'm a big fan of this idea of the memory palace as a kind of template, because essentially we are now living in the era of what Derrida liked to call archive fever, where everyone is updating and uploading and collecting data and then using that to create a new kind of identity, a new kind of self. So this is the era of the memory palace. But amusing enough, as we move into more and more of a complex era where people are exchanging files, exchanging, and so on, we see much more of a conservative take in terms of how people view history. This is a photograph recently of palaces in Timbuktu that were libraries that Muslim fundamentalists destroyed. Now, I'm using this as an example not against Islam whatsoever, because I think it's an incredibly profound religion. But the idea that the modernist cosmopolitan impulse to share and to create much more of a robust exchange between cultures has now impacted on a right wing or more of a conservative approach to history. These are things that I find intriguing. You can find a similar example in the Buddhas of Bamiyan, but I always love to think that the paradox of all these ideas of identity and control of identity, you can see a paradox right here. So if you look at the Buddhas of Bamiyan, when the Taliban took over Afghanistan, one of the first actions that they did was to destroy history, to erase it. You can see one of the earliest examples of Buddhist statues that was erased. So the tragedy of that is that history conditions how we think of the self, but if we're always playing with this idea of selective amnesia, of editing of memory, then how does that affect culture? So Johannes Kepler had a great essay about, again, harmony of the world. I'm very interested in this idea of nonlinear approaches to sampling and collage to create a more robust idea of the memory palace. So we look at the new city, and we can think about this idea of the acoustic space of the urban landscape. And again, because we're in Italy, I want to go back to the Italian futurists. In 1915, Luigi Russolo wrote an excellent book called Arte del Rumore, of the art of noise. Now, him and Marinetti had a series of kind of interesting relationships about fascism on one hand, but also the way sound and the city would create a new kind of acoustic instrument, a new kind of way of thinking about the urban landscape as a generative engine. So the reason I'm going to end my discussion with this is that I feel that sound is one of the most open places in culture, one of the most dynamic and elusive. So if we're thinking about love, that quality of it being able to trade and exchange the gift of sound, that's something that I hope to leave today as a provocation. And above all, I would like to just say that I'm a huge fan of Luigi Russolo. And you can see, this was punk rock 1915. The audience was very angry, and they were not in love with the sound. As a matter of fact, they said, hey, where's the band? So they started throwing bottles at them. And I'm sure it's Italy, you guys are very high energy. So this became a very controversial music movement. But the idea here is that you have the recording becoming the performance. So there's no longer a sense that the actual original recording, the archive, is conditioning the live experience. So these are things that I'm finding more and more how philosophy, if you look at Deleuze and Guattari and the idea of what they call 1,000 plateaus of experience, mnemonics conditioning networks. So I'm going to leave that today as a provocation, and just want to say thank you for listening, and it's been a pleasure.